In September 2025, 4 individuals met their fate at the hands of the state, an event that would leave a lasting mark on the ongoing debates surrounding capital punishment in America. These executions are more than just a legal matter. They are a reflection of a complex, often flawed justice system, one that raises difficult questions about fairness, morality, and the very notion of justice. For decades, the death penalty has been a controversial tool, seen by some as a necessary measure for the most heinous crimes, while others view it as an irreversible and morally bankrupt solution. Each of the 4 cases carries its own unique narrative, stories of violence, remorse, and unwavering defiance. The execution of David Joseph Pittman, for example, was a moment not just for the victims' families, but for everyone who questions whether justice has truly been served. Was he a cold-blooded killer? Or was he a victim of an unforgiving system? This is the story of lives lost, decisions made, and the agonizing line between justice and retribution. As you follow the cases of Pittman, West, Milam, and Jones, you'll confront the stark reality of capital punishment and perhaps question where the line between right and wrong should truly be drawn. Are these executions a step toward justice or a tragic reminder of how broken our system can be? Let's take a closer look at the cases that have made September 2025 a month that will be remembered for more than just the end of lives. It will stand as a reminder of the profound consequences of the decisions we make in the name of justice.
Welcome back to Fatal Verdict. In today's video, we'll take you through the timeline of 4 intense and controversial cases that unfolded in September 2025. We'll start with David Joseph Pittman, a man whose brutal crime shook Florida to its core. Then, we'll examine Geoffrey Todd West, whose actions and the emotional plea of the victim's son will leave you questioning what true justice means. Next, we'll dive into Blaine Keith Milam, a man whose horrific crime against a young child and the debates surrounding his mental state will stir emotions you might not expect. And finally, we'll explore Victor Tony Jones, a man whose violent act and lack of remorse during his execution will challenge your views on the death penalty. Through these stories, we'll look at the crimes, the legal battles, and the ultimate decisions that led to these executions. Each case raises tough moral questions about the criminal justice system, the death penalty, and the line between justice and vengeance. Before we begin, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and leave a comment below letting us know where you're watching from. For those of you who haven't subscribed yet, we'd love to hear why. Drop a comment and let us know your thoughts. Your input matters and it helps us make content that you'll keep coming back for. Let's get started.
On the evening of June 6, 1990, David Joseph Pittman carried out a plan that had been simmering for months. His wife, Bonnie Knowles, had made the decision to end their marriage, and Pittman was unable to accept it. That night, he arrived at the Knowles family home, consumed by rage and intent on confrontation. He began by cutting the phone lines, ensuring that no one could call for help. Then, armed with a knife, he entered the house. Bonnie, who was in bed, was the first to be attacked. What followed was an eruption of violence, fueled by an anger that seemed to be about more than just the divorce. Bonnie's parents, who were visiting, became the next victims. Pittman's actions were swift, and after he committed the murders, he set the house on fire, likely to destroy evidence and leave no trace of his involvement. Neighbors were the first to notice something was wrong when thick smoke began rising from the home. Firefighters responded quickly, but by the time they managed to extinguish the flames, the full scale of the crime was evident. The house was destroyed, but the bodies of the victims were found. As the investigation turned to Pittman, evidence began to mount against him. Despite this, Pittman continued to deny his involvement, maintaining his innocence. His refusal to accept responsibility added a chilling layer to an already tragic case, one that would spark a lengthy legal battle and force the community to grapple with the depth of his actions. David Joseph Pittman's legal battle began immediately after his arrest, with a defense centered on two core elements: his innocence and his claim of intellectual disability. His attorneys argued that Pittman was mentally impaired and therefore incapable of fully understanding the consequences of his actions. This claim of disability became the foundation of the defense strategy, shaping the trajectory of his case for over 30 years.
Pittman's defense team presented multiple psychological evaluations, each suggesting that he lacked the cognitive capacity to comprehend the severity of the crime. These evaluations were intended to argue that his intellectual limitations should exempt him from the death penalty. The legal system was forced to examine whether someone with such impairments could be held to the same standards as a person with a fully functional mind. Despite these arguments, Pittman's case remained contentious. Opposing experts claimed that his disability did not absolve him of responsibility for his actions. They argued that while Pittman may have faced challenges, he was still capable of planning and executing the crime. The case became an ongoing legal tug-of-war, with appeals and new evidence emerging year after year. As the years passed, Pittman's claims of innocence remained constant, but the mounting evidence against him painted a troubling picture. Despite a jury's conviction and extensive documentation of his role in the crime, Pittman refused to acknowledge guilt. This denial stirred further debate, with some believing his conviction was a miscarriage of justice, while others felt the evidence was irrefutable. Pittman's case raised questions about the fairness of the death penalty, especially in situations involving individuals with intellectual disabilities. Legal experts and advocates for reform pointed to this case as an example of the potential flaws in capital punishment, while others insisted that Pittman's crime warranted the ultimate penalty, regardless of his mental state. The moral and legal complexities of his case would continue to challenge the system throughout his time on death row, leaving the public to grapple with the question: was justice served, or was Pittman a victim of a broken system?
At 6:17 p.m. on September 17, 2025, David Joseph Pittman was executed at the Florida State Prison. The execution had been years in the making, marked by a series of appeals, claims of innocence, and debates over his mental state. As Pittman entered the execution chamber, the atmosphere was tense. The room was filled with witnesses, family members, legal professionals, and a few journalists, each there to witness the end of a 35-year-long legal battle. Pittman, calm and composed, was strapped to the gurney as the procedure began. The legal team carried out the standard process for lethal injection, a practice followed in Florida's capital punishment cases. Pittman's final moments were quiet, his expression steady. There was no visible sign of fear or emotion. He remained focused, refusing to acknowledge any guilt for the crime he had been convicted of. Just before the drugs were administered, Pittman spoke his final words. "I know you all came to watch an innocent man be murdered by the state of Florida." His voice was firm, a stark reminder that throughout the entire ordeal, he had never wavered from his belief that he had been wrongfully convicted. His defiance remained undiminished, even as his life was ending. As the lethal injection took effect, Pittman's breathing slowed, and at 6:22 p.m., he was declared dead. His final statement left an imprint on those present, reflecting the complex nature of his case and the questions that had persisted for decades. Was Pittman truly innocent, or had justice finally caught up with him? The answer, like the man himself, remains a matter of ongoing debate.
Looking at David Joseph Pittman's case, I can't help but wonder, did we execute an innocent man? After 35 years on death row, his unwavering claim of innocence leaves me questioning whether we have truly perfected the system of justice, or if it's merely a machine of convenience that closes cases with brutal finality. How many innocent people are we willing to sacrifice for the sake of closure? Pittman denied his guilt until his last breath, and yet we as a society decided that the cost of potentially getting it wrong was worth it. Should we continue to trust a system that may not even have the capacity to admit its own errors? But let's flip this. What about the victims? Do they find justice in Pittman's execution, or are we just feeding the cycle of revenge masked as justice? The idea that someone can die in a controlled, sterile environment to balance the scales of a crime when that same system can't guarantee fairness is deeply unsettling. Why do we still think the death penalty is the answer when it's so clear that it has more to do with vengeance than true justice? If there's a chance Pittman was innocent, doesn't that make every execution under the death penalty a risk of turning murder into state-sanctioned policy? As we reflect on the complex layers of Pittman's case, we now turn our attention to the story of Geoffrey Todd West, whose actions and the emotional plea of the victim's son raise tough questions about justice and redemption. This case challenges our understanding of forgiveness, punishment, and the consequences of past choices.
On the night of April 25, 1997, Geoffrey Todd West entered a gas station in New Hope, Alabama, with one thing on his mind: robbery. Margaret Parishberry, a 52-year-old mother, was working her shift at the station when West approached her. What followed was a swift and decisive act that ended her life. West, in his attempt to steal money from the station, took a step that would irreversibly change everything. The details of the crime unfolded quickly. What began as an ordinary shift for Margaret turned into a deadly confrontation. West's actions were cold, calculated, and devoid of any remorse, ensuring that his crime would leave lasting consequences not only for him, but for the people who loved Margaret. Margaret's son, Will Berry, would bear the emotional burden of that night for the rest of his life. After hearing news of the robbery, Will rushed to the scene, only to find himself face to face with the unimaginable: his mother, gone. The trauma of witnessing his mother's death, knowing that it was a random, senseless act, would stay with him forever. As the police investigated, Will was forced to confront a harsh reality. He could not undo what had been done. The emotional scars from that night lingered, leaving Will grappling with feelings of anger, loss, and confusion. No amount of justice would bring back his mother, but the legal proceedings that followed would force him to reckon with what had happened, raising questions about forgiveness, closure, and whether true justice could ever be achieved for victims like him. Will Berry's journey following his mother's death was filled with complexity. After witnessing the aftermath of Margaret Parishberry's murder, he was left to grapple with a profound sense of loss and confusion. But as the years passed, Will began to struggle with more than just his grief. He began to question the very foundation of justice itself. Unlike what many might expect from a victim's son, Will did not seek revenge. Instead, he found himself wrestling with the moral implications of the death penalty. Though West had taken his mother's life, Will became one of the most vocal opponents of the death penalty. His stance was clear. He didn't want another life taken in his mother's name. He wanted justice, but not at the cost of another death. His decision to publicly advocate for West's life to be spared was met with shock. How could the son of a murder victim ask for mercy for the person who had destroyed his family? Will's response was simple. He did not believe that vengeance would bring him peace or closure. He believed that true justice went beyond punishment and required compassion, even for those who committed unspeakable acts. Will's plea was more than just an appeal for mercy. It was a challenge to the traditional approach to justice. He questioned whether the state should have the power to take a life, regardless of the circumstances. His position forced people to reflect on the purpose of punishment. Was it to heal, to exact retribution, or to prevent further harm? In Will's eyes, mercy could be as powerful as punishment, and he believed that the cycle of violence could only end when society stopped viewing retribution as the ultimate answer. His emotional appeal turned the focus of the case away from the typical narratives of guilt and retribution. Instead, it raised profound questions about forgiveness, justice, and the capacity for healing. By advocating for West's life to be spared, Will confronted the moral paradox that many struggle with. When faced with profound loss, do we continue the cycle of violence, or do we choose to break free from it?
As we reflect on the complexities of West's case, we now move to another challenging story, the case of Blaine Keith Milam, whose actions and the ensuing legal debates would further test our understanding of justice. This next chapter forces us to confront not just the crime, but the deeper moral questions surrounding punishment and mental health. In 2008, Blaine Keith Milam committed a crime that would shock everyone who learned of it. Milam, who had been living with Jessica Carson and her 13-month-old daughter, Amora, grew increasingly fixated on the idea that Amora was possessed. He became convinced that the child needed to be purged of evil, interpreting religious teachings in a dangerously distorted way. Milam's growing obsession led him to believe that he alone could rid the child of this supposed demon. His actions, however, were not acts of mercy, but of cruelty. He believed his violent actions were necessary for her spiritual salvation. Over the span of 30 hours, Milam subjected Amora to a series of extreme and misguided attempts to save her. His actions were grounded in a twisted belief that what he was doing was a religious duty. As he carried out his perceived exorcism, Milam's behavior became more erratic and unstable. Jessica Carson, the child's mother, was initially unaware of the full extent of Milam's actions, although she had noticed his growing instability. By the time the authorities intervened, it was too late. The damage had been done. Milam was arrested, and the true horror of what had transpired came to light.
The tragedy sent shockwaves through the community, raising questions about the intersection of mental illness, religious extremism, and personal responsibility. Milam's belief in his own mission to save Amora made him blind to the reality of his actions. This case remains a poignant example of how dangerous a twisted interpretation of faith can become when combined with emotional and psychological instability. The impact on Jessica Carson, left to cope with the unimaginable loss of her daughter and the betrayal by someone she trusted, would be felt for the rest of her life. The legal case surrounding Blaine Keith Milam's conviction was marked by significant controversy, particularly over the forensic evidence used to secure his sentence. A key piece of evidence was bite mark analysis, which has since been widely criticized for its inaccuracies. Experts later argued that the bite mark evidence used against Milam was unreliable, yet it played a crucial role in the prosecution's case. Despite concerns about its validity, it was heavily relied upon, raising serious questions about the integrity of the evidence and whether it should have been a determining factor in such a significant case. In addition to the flawed forensic evidence, Milam's defense team highlighted his intellectual disability, arguing that it should have been taken into account during his trial.
Psychological evaluations suggested that Milam lacked the cognitive capacity to fully comprehend the consequences of his actions. However, these claims were not given the weight they deserved in court. The failure to address his mental health raised difficult questions about whether someone with intellectual disabilities should be held to the same standards in the criminal justice system.
Milam's execution sparked a broader debate on the morality of the death penalty. Was it just to carry out an execution based on unreliable evidence and an incomplete understanding of Milam's mental state? The case highlighted the flaws in the justice system, questioning whether the pursuit of punishment outweighed the need for fairness and accuracy. Could Milam's execution truly be considered justice, or was it an irreversible consequence of a flawed legal process? These questions continue to challenge the legitimacy of the death penalty and the integrity of the justice system. On September 26, 2025, Blaine Keith Milam was executed by lethal injection at the Texas State Penitentiary. The execution was filled with tension, a stark reminder of the finality of capital punishment. The room was filled with witnesses, including legal representatives, journalists, and members of the public, each left to process the weight of this moment. As the execution procedure began, Milam was strapped to the gurney. The process, methodical and precise, was carried out with little outward emotion from Milam. His expression remained calm, but the tension in the room was palpable. The weight of the event, combined with the controversial nature of his crime and the legal questions surrounding his conviction, hung heavy in the air.
Milam's execution was controversial, not only due to the nature of the crime he had committed, but also because of the ongoing debates about the fairness of his trial and the methods used to convict him. As the lethal drugs were administered, there was no sign of physical distress from Milam. His silence through the procedure left many wondering if the weight of his actions and the questions of his guilt ever truly registered with him. Was he accepting his fate, or was he merely resigned to it? Just before the execution began, Milam made his final statement. He spoke of his belief in religious redemption, claiming that he had found forgiveness through faith. He expressed no remorse for the crime itself, instead focusing on his personal transformation. His final words added a layer of complexity to his death. Was this a man seeking peace with his own conscience, or was it an attempt to redeem himself in the eyes of others? His religious claim shifted the focus from the crime to the moral and spiritual implications of his life and death, leaving questions about the sincerity of his transformation. Milam's execution and his final statement raised troubling questions about justice, redemption, and the human capacity for change. As we reflect on the complexities surrounding Milam's execution, we now turn to the case of Victor Tony Jones, whose violent crime and subsequent legal battles raised even more questions about justice and the death penalty. This next chapter challenges us to examine not only the nature of his actions, but the deeper psychological and societal factors at play.
On the evening of August 15, 2009, Victor Tony Jones committed a brutal crime that shattered the lives of Matilda and Jacob Nestor. Jones, once trusted by the couple, had been invited into their home, but what began as an evening of hospitality quickly turned into a devastating act of violence. He attacked them without warning, betraying their trust in a violent and calculated manner. The assault was shocking, and the nature of the attack made it clear that this was not a random act, but the result of deep-seated rage. In the midst of the chaos, Jacob Nestor fought back, determined to defend himself and his wife. He grabbed a firearm in a desperate attempt to protect them both, but his efforts were cut short. In his final moments, Jacob managed to fire the weapon, wounding Jones in the process. Though Jacob's resistance did not save him, it marked the end of the assault. His actions became a crucial part of the investigation, offering a glimpse into the courage he displayed in the face of danger. Jones, wounded but alive, fled the scene, leaving Matilda and Jacob to suffer the consequences of his violent outburst. The brutality of the attack, combined with the profound sense of betrayal, left the community in shock. How could someone who had once been trusted as a friend commit such an act? Jacob's last act of defiance was one of the few moments of resistance in a night of violence that would forever change the lives of those who knew the Nestors. Jones was eventually apprehended, but the psychological impact of that night lingered, raising questions about how trust can be so easily shattered and the lasting effects of such violent acts.
On September 30th, 2025, Victor Tony Jones was executed at the Florida State Penitentiary after spending over a decade on death row. The atmosphere in the room was heavy as witnesses gathered, including family members, legal officials, and media representatives, all awaiting the finality of the event. Jones had been fighting his conviction for years, but with his execution, the legal process came to a close. For many, this was a moment of closure for the Nestor family, but for others, it highlighted the deep divisions within the community about the use of the death penalty. Jones's case had sparked debates about fairness and justice, but on this day, it was clear that the decision had been made. As the lethal injection was administered, Jones lay silently on the gurney. His expression gave little away, and his composure stood in stark contrast to the tension surrounding him. There were no emotional outbursts, no final pleas, just a quiet acceptance of the moment. The silence in the room was deafening, with each witness left to process the significance of what was happening. When asked if he had any final words, Jones's response was brief and to the point. "No, sir." There was no remorse, no acknowledgement of the lives lost, only a short, unemotional answer. His lack of a heartfelt statement stood out and added a layer of complexity to his execution. Was this indifference, or was it simply a man accepting his fate? His final words, or lack thereof, left those present with unsettling questions about his true feelings and the nature of justice in this case. The room remained quiet as Jones's life was taken, leaving behind the lingering question: did his execution bring the closure it was meant to, or did it only deepen the mystery surrounding his crime?
The executions of individuals like Victor Tony Jones and Blaine Keith Milam force us to confront tough moral and ethical questions that ripple through society. For the victims' families, the idea of justice being served through the death penalty might seem like a necessary conclusion, but does it truly bring peace? While some may feel a sense of closure, others are left wondering whether taking another life in response can ever be justified. For the families of the condemned, the prolonged emotional toll of waiting for an execution can be as agonizing as the crime itself. The finality of an execution leaves no room for redemption, and the families are left with deep, unanswered pain. The national debate surrounding the death penalty continues to intensify with each case, and these recent executions have only fueled the conversation. Some argue that capital punishment is necessary to protect society and bring justice for heinous crimes, while others see it as a failed system that has too many flaws to be trusted. Increasing concerns over wrongful convictions, especially when evidence may be unreliable, have made the death penalty a controversial practice. These executions, in particular, bring to light how emotions, political pressure, and systemic failures complicate what should be a straightforward pursuit of justice. As we reflect on these cases, many critical questions remain. Does justice truly serve its purpose when one life is taken for another? How can we be confident that those who are executed are genuinely guilty, particularly when flaws in the justice system seem so prevalent? These cases highlight the significant imperfections within the system, leaving us to consider: can society ever truly achieve justice through execution, or are we simply perpetuating a cycle of loss and violence? The unanswered questions surrounding the death penalty demand a closer examination,
forcing us to confront the true meaning of justice in a flawed world.
If you found this documentary thought-provoking, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content that tackles the complex issues surrounding executions, justice, and moral debates in modern society. Your engagement helps us continue to explore these important topics and bring you deeper insights into the intricacies of the criminal justice system. Thank you for joining us in this exploration of one of the most controversial and divisive issues of our time. We appreciate your attention and your thoughts on these difficult subjects. Be sure to stay tuned for our next video, where we'll take a closer look at the evolving debates on the death penalty, its impact on society, and how legal systems around the world are grappling with these moral questions. Until next time, we invite you to keep questioning, keep thinking, and keep exploring.